Hi, welcome to my podcast, Reclaim. I am your host, Thaís Sky. I have supported women navigate the complexities of being human for over 10 years. This podcast is where I disseminate some of those learnings and offer thoughts and guests to guide you into your healing. Welcome. Hello, listeners. Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the podcast. I am so happy to be here with you all. I have been really enjoying the podcast the past few weeks. I've just been really looking forward to recording these episodes and feeling really just honored by your listen. Thank you so much for being here with me. I want to talk about relationship and worth. But first, almost every single cohort of Worthy Women Rise, I have opened up some seats for scholarship and pay what you can applicants. This cohort is no different. I am currently accepting applications for people who are interested in getting a scholarship and or interested in a pay what you can option. If you have been really itching to join Worthy Women Rise, but finances have continued to be a major barrier for you, I want to give you an opportunity to be a part of this really special, intimate container. You can go to worthywomenrise.com and there's a link at the bottom for the applications for scholarship / pay what you can. So if you're interested in joining us, this episode is being released on Tuesday, February 22nd, and I need your application in by Wednesday, February 23rd by 9 p.m. Pacific in order for you to be considered. And I will let you know by Thursday because our program starts on Sunday. So if you are interested in learning more about Worthy Women Rise, you can go to worthywomenrise.com. If you want to pay in full, you can pay in full. I've kept that open. If you want a scholarship, if you want to do a pay what you can go to the application, put in all of your information, and I will let you know by Thursday. Okay, so go to worthywomenrise.com. Now, if you are new to Reclaim or haven't been listening for more than, maybe a year, I have done 2 series on worthiness because I talk about worthiness a lot. One of these series I called 10 Days of Worth, where I talked about worthiness every day for 10 days. And then I shared it on the podcast. If you can actually go to my website and go to podcast and then click on each of these series and you can learn all about every single episode in the series. It's very accessible and easy for you to navigate and listen to all of these episodes. But I've talked a lot in a 10 Days of Worth series about worthiness. I talked about the belief systems. I've talked about how unworthiness plays out. I've talked about emotions. I talked about busyness as an intimacy issue. I talked about money and worth. I talked about how to navigate fear, desires, and how to get out of your own way. It's a really potent series. So you can go to my website. You can check that out. I've also done a Reclaiming Worth series, where it's a 10-part audio series of what it means to reclaim your worth in this messy world. And in that series, we talked about shame. We talked about tending to the wound. We talked about not all boundaries are created equal. We talked about emotions. We talked about food and worthiness. We talked about what it means to soften your edges, rigidity, expectations, self-mothering. I talk about intimacy, taking up space. And so you can get all of the episodes of that series also on my website, all easily accessible. However, these are also all episodes that I've shared on Reclaim. So wherever you're listening to the podcast, you can scroll down and you'll also get the Reclaiming Worth series and the 10 Days of Worth series. The reason why I'm sharing any of this with you is I realized the other day as I was going through all of the work that I've done and all of the information that I've shared about worthiness that I haven't really had a whole episode dedicated towards relationship and worth, the intersection, or how does our worthiness wound play into our relationships. Now, I have shared, right, that I believe that the worthiness wound is a relational wound. It's an emotional wound stemming out of relationships. And so while I have talked a lot about that, I haven't specifically talked about how that may actually now be playing out in relationships. in Worthy Women Rise, I talk about the program is basically consists of two main pillars. Pillar one is education and knowledge, and you get that through the 13 modules that I share with you throughout the program. And these modules are evidence-based, they're curated based on my expertise, my knowledge, and all of the work that I've done with hundreds of women over the years. Those are really potent modules. That's pillar one. The second pillar, out of the two pillars that hold up the program and create such a transformational container, is the experiential learning. It's the fact that every week we meet as a group to process and explore and talk about and work through what we're learning in the modules and how it intersects with our lives. Now, this second pillar is how we begin to address the fact that the worthiness wound is a relational wound, because the way that we relate to the group, the way that we relate to ourselves is going to play out in the group in a really unique and special way. Okay, so our relational imprint, the way in which we understand relationships, the way in which we understand ourselves are all driven out of relationships, formative relationships from childhood. This is very common knowledge, psychology, but it has very profound consequences. If we think about relationships as a map, literally like a map, right, with a compass and everything, when we're now looking at a new map, when we're looking at a new terrain, a new relationship, a person we've never seen before, we use this relational map that got created within us through our relationships to now understand our current relationships. So if we're going to take the metaphor to the next level and think about it as an actual physical map, right? Let's say you're in second grade. I don't actually know how old we are when we learn about maps, but let's just say second grade, you learned how to read a map. You learned that blue tends to be water. You learned that green tends to be land, right? You learned that generally, the lighter the color, the higher the altitude, right? Generally speaking, maybe you've learned about compasses. You've learned about how 1 inch on a piece of paper is 1 kilometer in real life, right? Like you learned the general knowledge of how to read a map so that no matter what map you're looking at, you know how to read it. Yes? So let's say that you learn how to read a map. Now you're staring at a totally new map. Well, you're going to use everything that you've learned in a previous map reading skill set to learn how to read this map. You're not starting over. It would be very exhausting and confusing if every time we looked at a new object, we had to relearn what it was. We had to relearn what a table was. We had to relearn how to use a computer, right? Our brain is brilliant and powerful machine, and it has learned all these things. Neural pathways have been created that allow you to understand what you're looking at. So your second grade knowledge, even though you may not have read maps for a long time, if I put a map in front of you, odds are there are some things that you're going to know about it, right? Like you're going to know how to read it. Even if you don't maybe know all of the details of how to read it, you're going to have a general idea. This is exactly in some ways, this is in many ways what relationship templates can look like. We have developed metrics, systems for how to understand ourselves and how to understand relationships based on very formative relationships, predominantly, usually parents. But I understand that there may be other caregivers around you that established and help you understand your formative relationships, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, adoptive parents, right? Any and all people who were around you when you were growing up is what I mean by formative relationships. And obviously this is much more nuanced because, well, we don't really know that we're operating off a template. It's just how we know. It's just how we see things. So it's like a fish in the water. You can't tell the fish that they're in water because the fish is in water. It doesn't know anything else. It's similar to that, where we don't even know that there's a template operating because, well, we're the fish in the water. So I'm here to tell you that the way you're seeing the world is actually based on your formative relationships. The way that you understand yourself is based on formative relationships. All the ways in which you navigate complexities of the human experience is in many ways can be understood by your formative relationships. And that's where a lot of my work comes in, because I help to bring a different perspective and help us understand how these relationships are playing out within our relationship. I have a particular language, I have a particular way of looking at our relationship, and I can understand how you may be operating in your life given the context of our relationship. Well, the same goes for Worthy Women Rise. How you relate to the group, how you relate to participants in the group, how you relate to each other very much sets up, it gives us a hint, it gives us ideas of how your formative relationships may have set out. Okay, so what does this have anything to do with relationship and worth? Well, if we look at everything through this lens, right, that our formative relationships help us establish our template for which a blueprint for which we see relationships now, how we understand ourselves, how we understand the world, most relationships, not just relationships with people, but most relationships with most things can be understood through this lens. Let's look specifically at how it may be playing out within our partnerships, our intimate relationships. I'm talking about lifelong relationships, right? I'm talking about intimate partners, spouses, husband, wife. It doesn't have to fit kind of that cultural lens, but any intimate relationship, whether it's boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever you want to name it, this is what I want to talk about with you today. How may the worthiness wound play out in your relationships? Now, if the worthiness wound is a relational wound, it is going to 100,000,000% play out in your relationships. Not only will it is currently playing out. If you identify as someone who has a worthiness wound, or if you identify as someone who has sensed that your worth really jeopardizes or comes into the equation of your life in many ways, if you resonate with my podcast, my Instagram, right? Like if you resonate with the worthiness series that I've done, Reclaim Your Worth, or Reclaim, why am I forgetting the name of the series? Yeah, Reclaiming Worth. Okay, I wasn't going crazy. Reclaiming Worth and 10 Days of Worth. If those resonate with you, well then odds are your worthiness wound is playing out in your relationships. And I highly doubt that that's probably a surprise for you, because that tends to be where we see it the most. It's where we tend to really be in contact with our inadequacies, particularly dating. I think the dating world really can evoke strong feelings within us for those of us who chronically identify as broken, inadequate, too much. I think that dating can really bring up some difficult feelings. And so I asked you all on Instagram to give me some questions for me to talk about on this podcast today about worthiness and relationships. And y'all have come through. I have some questions here to talk about. And I also want to go above and beyond the questions and just shape this conversation or help us think about how may the worthiness wound show up in dating? How may it show up in your conflict? How may it show up in the way in which you relate to your needs? How may it show up in the way in which you communicate? Let's talk about it, because well, as we tend to the worthiness wound, we tend to also create more fulfilling and nourishing relationships, more intimate relationships. We're able to sustain relationships longer. We're able to go deeper in our relationships. We're able to hold more of our own within a relationship. You know, one of the modules that we talk about in Worthy Women Rise is attachment theory, which I know has become quite popular, and I know that it gets a lot of like hype, and we love to see ourselves in these little boxes, right? We love to know what our attachment style is. Well, I talk about attachment styles in a little bit more of a nuanced way in Worthy Women Rise, but the reason why I'm bringing it up is because it reminds me of this idea of secure attachment, right? Like, what does secure attachment really look like? This becomes a very important part of the conversations within Worthy Women Rise, because we have this idea of what secure attachment looks like. That's actually very different from what secure attachment actually looks like. Okay, so when we tend to think of like, okay, so I have the worthiness wound, I feel insecure in my relationships, right? Well, then what does it feel like to feel secure in my relationships? What does security even look like or feel like? And what we tend to think is that security, to feel secure in a relationship, means to never feel insecure. Just like we imagine that to feel worthy means to never feel unworthy. That if we are securely attached, then we don't have inadequacies, we don't have concerns, we don't have fears. We're able to be very confident in our our relationships. We're not afraid of abandonment. We're not afraid of rejection because we are secure in the relationship, right? So we tend to think that secure is the absence of insecurity. And that it means that it's almost like akin to what we tend to think of happiness, right? Happiness is a destination, or healing is a destination. It's a point in time when you do the work now, you'll get to a point in time where you will always feel happy, or you will always feel satisfied, you'll always feel congruent, you'll always feel authentic, right? We tend to use these words, and we really imagine that it's a destination, even if we may know it's not, even if we consciously are aware. And I know, Thaís, I know it's not a destination. I think many of us secretly really hope that there will be a point in time where all of this inner work will create something that we can kind of ground our stake in, right? That we can kind of stake the claim, that we can arrive at, just like going to the moon, that we'll finally, after all this work and all this training and all this money and all of this stuff that we're pouring in, we're going to get to the moon and it's going to feel so good. Oh my gosh, the fantasy is so alive, right? It's going to feel so good. And ideally, we'll get to the moon because someone told us how to do it. They're going to show us a step-by-step, right? Like they're going to unveil it within us. That's a fantasy number 2 that I know that many of us grapple with and have a hard time with, because it can feel so tantalizing, can feel so alive, this sense of wanting to be saved and wanting healing to be a destination. And so we look at secure attachment very similarly, that it is something that you just arrive at. Well, I am going to tell you that that is not what secure attachment looks like. Shocker. Surprise. What I'm talking about here, what does it mean to cultivate worth, and what does it look like then in our relationships, is not that you'll never feel insecure, you'll never be afraid of abandonment, you'll never feel afraid of rejection. Because being afraid of rejection, or being afraid of being abandoned, being left, being, broken up with, whatever, is a normal part of being human. It's biological, one, right? The need to belong and to be in a social community. It's so biological that it's in our primitive mind. Like it's just not going to go away because our prefrontal cortex told us to. Number one. Number two, there's nothing wrong with these fears. There's nothing wrong with being afraid of rejection. Who wants fucking rejection? I don't want rejection. Like who's looking forward to getting rejected? Like we don't go into things like, oh, I can't wait to be rejected today, especially by like an intimate partner that we're, seeing our future with. Like no one looks forward to that. So unfortunately, healing, and particularly because we're talking about the worthiness wound, healing the worthiness wound won't take away the very real consequences of being human. Like things are going to hurt, things are going to suck. I can't prevent that. I can't tell you it's not going to happen again. I can't tell you it's not going to hurt. It just doesn't exist. And when we remove our fears, we actually avoid an intimacy and a vulnerability with life that I help the women in Worthy Womanize get into contact with, which is that it's actually, we are vulnerable. We are vulnerable to rejection when we care a lot, when we have our heart on our hands. We're risking something, and that risk is what allows us to love, right? There is no love without risk. True, intimate, beautiful, profound, magical love comes with a tremendous amount of risk. It will end in heartbreak, whether that heartbreak is death or ending in some way. And so grief is a really important part of healing the worthiness wound, but we can't avoid grief. Loss and change, transition are just an integrative part of what it means to be alive. I remember when I was younger, I read a novel. I think it was a novel or a series of novels. I must have been like 12 or 13, about a girl who doesn't have fear. And I think that this is like a phenomenon, something that happens where you just don't have fear. And I imagine I can get into the medical of it, but I would have to research it. I don't know exactly what it is or how it happens, but it is true. There are, I think, a very small percentage of people out in the world who aren't afraid. Well, the book was really interesting because if you're not afraid, you kind of put yourself in quite reckless situations, which I think kind of connects us to this biological need for fear, that to be afraid is how we've survived. And we tend to think of our ancestors in some ways as like fearless or whatever. We tend to have fantastical ideas of our ancestors, but actually they had to be kind of afraid or else they wouldn't have survived, right? There's a certain amount of importance to fear from a biological standpoint. But also when you don't have fear, you don't really know your own limitations. And so you get hurt a lot. And I'm not just talking about emotional hurt, but physical hurt too. You're not afraid. And therefore, you just find yourself in continually precarious situations. Part of our ability to be vulnerable and intimate is being able to live with fear. If we don't have fear, then we actually can't be vulnerable, right? So vulnerability means grappling with our fears and our limitations. It's not the result of non-fear, right? And I think this kind of helps to evoke the sentiment that like bravery isn't the absence of fear, but it's fear in doing the thing anyway, or whatever, that type of idea, I think really goes well here. And so when we think about secure attachment, or we think about like, what does it look like to feel worthy in relationship? What does it feel? How do we imagine it's going to feel when our worthiness wound isn't so loud within our relationships? What will it look like? Well, whatever it looks like, however it looks like for you, given your context, your life, your relationships, your experience, your past, what I can definitively say is that it won't mean that you won't ever feel inadequate, that you won't ever be afraid that you are too much or not enough, or that you'll never have moments of doubt, insecurity, that you'll never be afraid of being rejected or abandoned. That's just not what kind of secure attachment or worthiness relating looks like. We don't do relational healing and find ways to thrive in our relationships so that no bad feelings ever arise. Bad feelings will arise. So it's not about the absence of those bad feelings, but how we know how to hold them, how we know how to make use of them, how we know how to relate to them. Right. So healing the worthiness one is not about never feeling inadequate, but about learning how to relate to our unworthiness so that it doesn't consume us, take over our lives and feel unconscious and paralyzing. What often happens for us is that we don't even know that the worthiness wound is playing out until we start to get really curious and we're in spaces where that curiosity can be fostered. Okay, so, if we're thinking more holistically or more robustly to feel secure, attached, or to attend to the worthiness wound within our relationships, what it definitively does mean, not the absence of fear, but certainly our ability to hold and grapple fear without sabotage. How many of us, because of our inability to really tend to navigate the worthiness wound, we've made some pretty reckless decisions, right? We've gotten into a fight and proclaimed that we're done and then ended a relationship in a very heightened state. Or how many of us have avoided relationships altogether out of fear that if we bring someone in close, then we're going to be really rejected, right? That we're going to find that somebody is going to validate that we are in fact not enough. How often do we have such high expectations or high standards for partners that we end up never being in relationship because the partner needs to be absolutely perfect, right? Due to our own kind of feelings of perfectionism. Again, all of it is with this hope that if we have the perfect person, then our vulnerability won't go in vain, right? That we won't be dropped, we won't be abandoned, we won't be rejected. So there's a lot of ways that I see the worthiness wound really play out in relationships. And I have here some questions around dating and then some questions around kind of longer term relationships that I want to address with you. Okay. So here's question number 1 about dating. Let's start with the conversation of dating. I don't feel worthy of dating the type of men I think I deserve. What do you think? I don't feel worthy of dating the type of men I think I deserve. Okay, so there's 2 things here. What is it? What do you deserve? what does it mean that you deserve? I really try to avoid the word deserve, because like what does even deserving mean? One could argue that we all deserve kind of the same things, right? And so when we're talking about deservability, now we start talking about what is fair. And that can get dicey because life isn't fair. I don't know of a single person who really deserved to get cancer, right? So if we're not talking about deserving from bad things happening, then we should avoid using the word deserve to mean good things happening too. So I tend to avoid that language, that word, because there's an entitlement to it that I think in some ways is very kind of human rightsy that I love, right? Like we all deserve good food. We all deserve drinkable water. We all deserve health. Like blah, 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 blah. These are all really beautiful moral ideas. But then when we start to break down and think about it in terms of philosophical standpoint, or we start to think biological and we start to think about evolutionary psychology, now we're starting to get a little dicey of like, does anyone deserve to die? Does anyone deserve to get murdered? You know, like, how much bad things must you have done in order to deserve something bad happening to you? Something that I think I talked about on my podcast a little bit while ago that I was really grappling with is like, how long after you've done a bad thing are you allowed to be happy? You raped somebody. How are you ever allowed to have a happy life after that? Or is that bad behavior, that bad thing that you did, eradicate any joy now from the rest of forever? It's easy when we're thinking about it from a smaller perspective, like you cheated on a test. Does that mean that you're not allowed to ever be happy again, right? But then we start to expand, like, okay, if you raped someone, are you ever allowed? How about if you murdered someone, are you ever allowed to be happy? But what if you murdered Hitler? Then are you allowed to be happy, right? There's a lot of complexities here. And so when we start to think about deservability, I get dicey. So I like to just remove that in general. Like in general, we all deserve to be happy, healthy, and free, right? Like, okay, we're going to remove that. So let's just go with, I don't feel worthy of dating the type of men I want. How about that for a language? Because now we're naming a desire. Now we're naming needs. Now we're talking about what it is that you want and feeling like you can't go after what you want. And so I imagine that a lot of this means that you tend to settle, or you tend to go after, for this particular person, men who, you know, doesn't treat you the way you want. And when I think about the ways in which the worthiness wound kind of keeps us in this spiral of either going after men that we feel like we're settling for or avoiding it altogether, now we're getting into contact with something that's really, really painful, right? That part of dating, part of building a relationship means putting yourself out there. It means getting into relationships. And this can feel really, really scary at the beginning. And so we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to find the right person, to know the right way, to have these beautiful aha moments, to feel this profound opening, to have the person be perfect, right? We have all this pressure, all this expectation. And I think that really does a dishonor to the complexity of dating, but also to what we're really asking when we're dating, which is does this feel good? You know, does this feel like a person that I'm enjoying spending my time with? And I think that that's so much more significant than trying to read people into whether you deserve them, whether they're who you want. You know, we think that we want certain things. We think we want a man who's a certain amount of handsomeness, right? We think we want a man that makes a certain amount of money. We think we want all these things. And we make all these lists. And then we deny the complexity of the person that's right in front of us, which is that I don't think that there are easy ways to make these types of decisions. And I think it's very contextual. I've been really enjoying watching Love is Blind. It's my favorite reality TV show. I think it's so silly. Oh my gosh, it's so silly, but so good because I think the essence of the question is really interesting to think about as a couples therapist and someone who works relationally is, well, is love blind? And is that enough for marriage? And, you know, one of the things that I have seen in this show is that these people really struggled with dating before getting into the show because they were really consumed by the physicality of the other person. And so many of them, now that they're engaged to be married and reflecting on, what hasn't worked in the past, a lot of them express that the things that I thought I wanted in a partner aren't actually what I wanted in a partner. Well, that can make it really confusing then. And that explains why these particular individuals, it didn't work out in the past. And so we really have to wonder, what is a relational need? And are the things that you want in a partner really what you need? Or are they just ways to check off boxes that deprives you of the vulnerability and the intimacy of being in relationship with somebody? I always thought, when you get into your ideal relationship, that they need to check off all the boxes, right? I thought this because, cultural invites this of us, that we have to have standards and they have to meet all these standards. But I find that relationships are often so much more complex. And remember what we talked about at the beginning about a relational map? So often we kind of find ourselves in similar relational patterns with individuals, and we don't even know it's happening because the relational template is playing out. Now, I'm not saying that we ask for shitty behavior. I'm not saying attracting. I'm not talking anything like that. What I am suggesting is that it can be really hard for us to imagine ourselves in partnerships that are very different from the partnerships and the ways that we've been related in childhood, because our template tends to come with us wherever we go. So if you're saying, I don't feel worthy of dating the type of men I think I deserve, right? That's the question that we're answering right now. Well, we have to first really think about for this particular individual, what does it mean to feel worthy? And what do you imagine you will then feel, what type of men you will date once you do feel worthy? What are the type of men that you're not necessarily falling into partnership with or you're not dating? What is this thing that you imagine that you'll be able to experience once you are worthy? Let's say it has to do with stability, right? That I want a man who is stable, and I keep finding myself dating men who are unstable, and I don't feel worthy of dating men that are stable. Okay, well then let's think about, how do you understand stability? What feels threatening about stability? What feels protective about dating men who are unstable? Maybe by dating men who are unstable, it plays out your inner instability, right? Maybe there's something about dating men that are stable that really feels like it will force you to now have to grapple with your own internal instability, and that can feel really scary. So this is more along the lines of trying to understand symbolically what we may be struggling with within relationships. So rather than, feel worthy and then you'll date the type of men you deserve, I go more into what are the things that you want and why do they feel so scary to have? What is happening in your relational template that's making it so that it feels like those qualities or those things feel impossible? Yes. Okay. And so when we're thinking about that, now we're not thinking about the relationship as transactionally, which is, they have qualities that I want, and I will only get into a relationship with people who have qualities that I want, but rather there's something happening within the relationship that is activating things within me and activating things within them. And as we can put language and understand all of our feelings and thoughts about the relationship, we can then understand ourselves better, and we can find relationships that feel most supportive for us. All of the internal things that we experience about a person is a part of the relationship. We don't experience someone in a vacuum. Everything that we experience about a person is also internally. It's in here too. It's in our hearts. So how we feel, how we think, how we're relating is important. This helps to explain why sometimes we feel really insecure in a relationship. We really doubt. We feel so overwhelmed by feelings of not enoughness. In other relationships, we feel really good and we feel really stable and we feel like we know our worth and we know how they feel about us, and it just feels really smooth. What's the difference? If we're the same person, right? It's because there's a third. There's the other person, there's you, and then there's the relationship. And the relationship is evoking feelings within the both of you. And that can be really useful information for us to look at. This is why, when we're thinking about dating, it's not helpful to think about dating as, I just struggle with intimacy, or I'm a serial dater. I can't get into an intimate relationship. It's not helpful to think about it too broadly, because when we're talking about these broad things, and it could be a variety of different reasons for why it may not be working out. But once we get into the specifics, once we get into the nitty gritty of what is really happening, what are you imagining? What is your internal world, and how may it be playing out in the relationship? Now we have so much data as to why you are a serial dater, right? Or why you're scared of intimacy, et cetera, et cetera. I hope this is all making sense. I feel like I'm babbling a little bit. So let me get back to the questions. Here's another question I received. I accept red flags because I think that's as good as I'm going to get. How do I stop doing that? Okay. Like I've been saying, this is a perfect question to follow up. I prefer not to think about things as red flags or green flags. I know sometimes they can be useful, so I'm not going to deny that. Everything has its use. And sometimes it can be really useful, especially if we didn't grow up in a really good environment. It can be really useful for someone to tell us, I don't think that's a good thing, right? Have you considered that maybe you're being manipulated, right? Or have you thought that maybe that behavior, that thing isn't good for you, right? It can be helpful to sometimes identify things as red flags or green flags. However, I don't think that, aside from the most obvious, physical abuse is an obvious red flag, right? Aside from the obvious things, I tend to think that flags are also contextual. What may be really helpful and good and red or green for some people may not be useful for other people. For example, let's think about, communication styles. You may be a person who needs someone who is constantly kind of in the loop with you, checking in with you, right? Being kind of very transparent about what they're doing, what's going on, right? You may really need that, and that may feel really important for you. And for other people, that may feel suffocating. That may feel like too much information. For those people, they just need a more looser check-in. They don't need to be in contact all the time. And for those people to be in contact less frequently feels more spacious, and it feels like they really trust the other person, and that's what they want and need. What's the red flag and what's the green flag, right? Just because you may need somebody to be in contact with you quite frequently, and you're dating someone who doesn't do that, doesn't mean that they are a red flag. It just may mean that they're not necessarily right for you. And so we have to think about the context and really give ourselves permission to be clear on what feels most useful for us. What type of relationships allow us to thrive the most? And then get curious about how it's showing up in your relationships. If you are the type of person who really does appreciate and like to be in touch with your partner on a pretty frequent basis, and you continually date people who disappear, who you don't hear from in large chunks of time, then that's important information for you, that there's a discrepancy, that there's something inviting attention. So accepting red flags. Let's say what this question means is that you're accepting behavior that you know you don't want. And it's very clear for you that you don't want it. Well, then it's important for you to get honest with yourself about what it is that you want, and can you communicate that with your person? So often we view relationships as transactional. And by that, I mean the person is just who they are, and we either have to conform and contort to who they are, or we reject them. But actually, so much of what long-term thriving relationship looks like is to be in continual conversation about needs and limits, about the fact that you may want something and the other person may not be able to provide it. There's a lot of compromise, I guess that's what I'm saying by that, but also a lot of these really rich conversations about how you're experiencing the relationship and the ways in which things maybe feel good and the ways in which things may not be feeling good. And something that was really profound for the last cohort of Worthy Women Rise is this idea that talking always makes things better. Always makes things better. And now better doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship, quote unquote, thrives, but better simply means that things shift inside when we talk about them. It's when we don't talk about them. It's when we resent and simmer and anticipate that the other person will be able to mind read and give us something that we're not willing to communicate. That's when things start to die. Talking about things makes things better. It shifts things. It breathes fire and air and life into the relationship and allows for things to shift and change. And sometimes that means shifting, changing, falling apart. And sometimes that means falling together. But it's certainly more fruitful than to not talk about things. So if you are accepting a red flag, because you think it's as good as it's going to get. Okay. So then the line of inquiry for me is, what are the red flags for you? Have you gotten clear on that? Is there a pattern there? What do you think the pattern is about? And also, have you talked about this with your person? If you continually talk about something with your person and they chronically shut you down or are not interested, then that's information for you about the growth and the trajectory of the relationship. All of it is just really important information. If a relationship dies because you've brought in your honest feelings, well, then that speaks to the strength of the relationship. And this can be really scary for some of us because I think many of us we relate to the other as an idea of the other rather than the actual other. And talking about things really forces us to have to be in the reality of the other. And that can be really confronting for those of us with worthiness wounds. We tend to be really overwhelmed by this reality of other because many of us with worthiness wound, people-pleasing, perfectionistic tendencies, we really like to operate out of a fantasy of how we understand the world and how we imagine other people understand us. And it's often very little based on reality. For example, people that really grapple with perfectionism, we really anticipate that everyone is judging us and that we're going to be easily rejected if we aren't perfect. But perfect is subjective, and we don't actually know what the other person is thinking. But we orchestrate a whole life around attempting to avoid the judgments of others because we're imagining what the other person is thinking of us. All of that is fantasy world. All of that is, and I say fantasy just to mean anything that's not literal reality. Dreams, hopes, wishes, it's all, I all put them under the umbrella of fantasy. This is all fantasy. We're not actually relating to the other. And it can actually feel really threatening and really scary to start actually relating to another and having these difficult conversations because we have to then grapple with the fact that the other person is an other person and not just a figment of our imagination or not just what we envision them judging us to be. That they actually may have a whole internal world that is outside of your control. And that can be really, really terrifying. So this is where dating can be really hard, is because I'm getting a sense as I'm answering these questions that I'm relating to these questions as if you can have these types of intimate conversations. And I can understand that when you're dating, when you're one date in, two dates in, it may feel really not have a foundation to talk about these things. And so I can understand that it can feel really intimidating to have these kind of clear, open dialogue at the beginning of a new relationship. But I'm always under the impression that it's a sincerity and an honesty and an open-heartedness in dating is more likely to lead to a success than to kind of keep holding back and mind reading, right? And hoping that the other person just knows. I think clear expectations, an open mind are two very important ingredients to a successful dating venture. And I think we're so terrified of rejection that we prevent ourselves from being really honest with the other person about what we're feeling. And then we ghost or we get ghosted because we have a hard time taking responsibility for our feelings. And so, one of the things that we talked about in Worthy Women Rise in the last cohort is how do I get the people around me to relate to me differently? I'm learning all these new relational skills. How do I kind of get the people around me to come on board? And the answer is, well, you have to go first. If you want the caliber of people that you date to increase, well, you have to go first by increasing the caliber of your own communication, right? Like you have to go first. If you want authenticity, if you want people to really meet you where you are, you have to go, right? You have to go. If you want an honest relationship, you have to show up honestly. You can't put the work on the other person and hope that somehow you'll find yourself in an honest relationship. Yes? Okay. All right, let's move a little bit into relationships. I'm noticing the time here. Okay, so how does the worthiness wound show up in relationships? I mean, there's many, 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 many ways, and we'll grapple with that in Worthy Women Rise of the ways in which the worthiness wound may show up for you in your relationships. But I wanted to make a list of some of the ways that I have seen particularly for how the worthiness wound shows up in relationships. One is assuming emotional fragility, right? So we tend to often in our relationships be really afraid to be kind of honest about how we're experiencing the relationship because we imagine that the other person is going to be really fragile about it, that they're not going to be able to hold it, that they're going to penalize us and reject us in some way. So we tend to assume emotional fragility onto the other. We really, I think, underestimate how much people can handle. And so what we tend to do is we tend to then bottle it all up and then it will just explode out. We want to be nice. We don't want to be difficult. We don't want the other person to know our insecurities. We don't want the other person to kind of see us doubt and then somehow we're going to seep doubt into their minds, right? Like we don't want them to leave us. And so we just kind of keep it all in. And then it comes out in other ways. It comes out through resentment. It comes out through a deadness in the relationship where there's no communication and there's no life. There's no sexuality, right? Like sexual joy, pleasure. We can see that relationships tend to die. And when couples come to me and I'm working with them in couples therapy, they often come very, very late. And oftentimes when they come, there's so much deadness. There's so much that hasn't been breathing life into. It's been neglected. It's been left to die. Much of which is because we're so afraid of the other person's response. And so part of what allows us to create a really thriving relationship is creating a relationship that allows for honesty, allows for complexity, allows for people to have their feelings, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything about us. And sometimes it can mean something about us, and it definitely means something about the quality of the relationship. This is, when I tend to think about something like cheating, we tend to think that the cheater is bad, and the victim, the one who got cheated on, is good. But actually, if we're looking at it from a lens of kind of more relationally, the cheating is a facet of the relationship. It's a part of the relationship. It happened because two people somehow played into the one person acting out by cheating. But people don't usually act out of a vacuum. There's something in the relationship that is also playing out in the cheating. I'm not saying that the victim somehow asked for it. No. But what I am suggesting is that cheating is much more layered and nuanced than just who was the bad guy and who was the good guy. And that there is that relational third, that relationship as a third unit that must be taken into consideration, that must be thought about what was going on here. One person acted out some sort of feelings that probably the other person also had. And so when we start to think about not assuming emotional fragility, we tend to be less surprised by things. Oftentimes, when we're assuming emotional fragility, the person ends the relationship and it feels like it came out of total left field, right? And it feels like such a surprise. And often that's a sign that things are not being spoken, things are not being said. There is an assumption of emotional fragility. Now, in order for us to be in a type of relationships where we don't assume emotional fragility, we also have to contend with our emotional fragility and the ways in which we may not be allowing our partner to be honest with us. Right? We get very dysregulated, we attack, we withdraw. There are all sorts of ways that we penalize our partner for being honest with their feelings. And this is important for us to really grapple with, because while we are emotionally fragile, our partner is not going to share. There's a removal of intimacy. And our emotional fragility and the worthiness wound tend to go hand in hand. Right? The worthiness wound tells us we're inadequate and we're broken. And so if somebody shares a doubt, or if somebody shares that they're unhappy in some way, then it feeds directly into the worthiness wound. See, I knew it. I knew I was broken. And then we become very overwhelmed and very dysregulated. And then we kind of take very erratic actions, or again, we withdraw, we shut down, etc. So that's just one way that I tend to see the worthiness wound really play out in long-term relationships. There's also the constant accommodating, right? A constant sense of being the one who does all of the accommodating. That's a big one where the worthiness wound tends to really show up, because it really goes hand in hand with this like people-pleasing narrative. Or if I make you happy, then somehow through that, you'll know how to make me happy. And so there's often this feeling of one-sidedness where you have the giver and you have the receiver. Again, it's a relational dyad. The accommodators tend to come into relationship with people who like to receive. You don't usually get two accommodators together. Usually accommodators get people who actually have an unapologetic connection to their needs. And there's something very enviable about that, right? About somebody who really knows what they want. And that can feel really yummy when we're first falling into love and relationship, because, we're imagining that we're going to learn from that. But then what tends to end up happening is the very thing that we fall in love with people with end up really grinding our goats. We end up getting very frustrated about it. And this is one of the dyads that I tend to see. The accommodator then starts to feel really resentful. They're doing everything. They're the backbone of the family. They're the emotional laborers. They're the ones that are really doing the thankless job of running the household. And then you have the receiver who doesn't know. It's kind of like the receiver, the accommodator tend to be like little ducks where they're paddling really hard underneath the water, but all you see is like a really graceful duck, right? That tends to be accommodators, where they're actually working very hard all the time to mind read, to assess, to judge, determine, to kind of estimate, to guess, and to do all of this emotional labory work. And the receiver doesn't know that this is happening. And then things start to fall apart when the accommodator becomes very resentful. But again, there's something in the relational dyad. It's not just that there's something wrong with the giver. Oh, if only they accommodated more, then I wouldn't have to accommodate so much. It's not that easy. There's something in the relationship that's worth investigating. And part of the work that you can do is really grapple with what it would mean to start to own your own needs in the relationship. Now, I will say, I have so many more bullet points I want to get to. I can't believe that we're almost at an hour here. So I'm going to stop, and then maybe I'll do a part 2. We'll see how I feel. But the thing that's really important to note is that when we're doing the self-development thing or the relational healing thing, when we're growing within ourselves, a question that we tend to come up against if we're in relationships is, how to bring our partners with us. Yes, how to have them grow too. And there can be a really deep fear when we're doing our own work that we're going to leave our partners behind, that they're not going to come, they're not going to join us. And to that, I think it's really important that we keep in mind that we can't just expect other people to grow because we're growing, but also that we can be in communication about what's happening. And the more that we share our own growth, the more we kind of invite people in, right? We invite our partners to get to be in it with us. And that could be a really wonderful way to just share with our partner how we're learning, how we're growing, and kind of model the power of this cool work that we're doing. But we have to be really careful with relationships that we don't go into it with this kind of binary idea that if somehow we grow and change, that they should grow and change with us, because we can miss out on a lot of kind of intimacy by demanding that the other person be different simply because we're growing and changing. When we change the psychological contract of a relationship, aka we're changing the ways in which things, expectations, or the way things go, people are going to tend to have reactions about it. And that doesn't make them necessarily quote unquote toxic, right? If you suddenly start to really feel in touch with and get excited about a boundary that you have come to terms with, the fact that you haven't had about this boundary before, and now you're kind of working towards enacting this boundary and upholding this boundary because you know that this is what's necessary in order for you to give more or whatever. If you don't let people into your process and you just do the whole boundary thing, it can be really hard for people, and they can have adverse reactions. I see this from a systemic lens when we think about family systems, and we tend to think of families as a unit of system, like a computer system. If you change one thing, the system is going to resist, and they're going to want to go back to homeostasis. They're going to go back to how the system was operating before. And so if we introduce change, it's going to create ripples in the system, and oftentimes the system is going to really resist. And so it's important that you, one, stand firm, continue to work on, whatever it is that you're working on, and also allow people into your journey, into your process. I'm also obviously talking about people that have given you the foundation for you to build on. Obviously nothing in this episode is talking about any type of abusive relationships or really chronically harmful, unsafe people. I maybe should have specified that at the beginning. I'm talking about really relationships that you want to maintain. If you want to maintain a relationship and yet you're also changing the dynamic of the relationship, the other person is going to have feelings about it, and they're allowed to have feelings about it, and you're allowed to still create the change. And sometimes it can be useful for you to communicate and to share your process and what's evolving and changing within you so that they feel like you're in it with them instead of just demanding that suddenly things be different. That's just a little tip that I have for you, because I tend to see this a lot coming up in couples work and in Worthy Women Rise. Bring people in with you. Talk to them, share with them your process, your journey, your growth. And not only will that, if they want to go into their own journey, seeing you go on yours can feel really inspiring. But also it certainly just allows for there to be further communication and dialogue and exploration together about your inner journey. Yes? Okay. So I think probably I'll do a part 2 on this because there is so much that we can talk about here. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Share with me on Instagram at I am Thaís Sky. And final call, if you're interested in joining Worthy Women Rise, go to worthywomenrise.com. You can apply there. And if you are interested in a pay what you can or scholarship opportunity, the application is also at worthywomenrise.com. All right, you all have a good one, and I'll see you next week.